Evie learned very early that being the older sister did not always mean being seen first. In her family, it mostly meant being expected to step aside with grace. Her younger sister, Sophie, arrived when Evie was 6, pink-faced and loud and immediately the center of every room she entered. Even years later, Evie could still remember relatives leaning over the pram and saying things like, "Oh, she's going to be a little star, this one," while Evie stood nearby in party tights holding a plate of sausage rolls nobody had asked her to carry. At first, it was small enough to ignore. Sophie was prettier, people said. More outgoing. More switched on. She spoke earlier, read earlier, smiled on command for photos and charmed adults without seeming to try. Evie was quieter. Slower to answer. The sort of child who liked closing doors behind her and sitting on bedroom floors with felt-tip pens and scraps of paper and whatever half-finished little idea had caught her that week. Her mother used to say, in the tone of someone trying to sound kind while placing a child on a shelf, "Evie's more inward." Her father preferred, "She'll find her thing." What they meant was that Sophie already looked like the kind of daughter people could mention with satisfaction. Evie was harder to show off. At school, the gap widened in all the ways families like to pretend are accidental. When Evie struggled in maths at 11, her parents said she just wasn't academic in the same way. When Sophie turned 11 and looked likely to pass the entrance exams for a better private school, they found the money from somewhere. Not loads of money. They made sure everyone knew that, but enough. Enough for tuition, uniform, bus fare, piano lessons because these things help polish a girl. Evie stayed where she was. That was not the cruelty by itself. The cruelty was how openly it was discussed as practical. "There's no point stretching ourselves for both," her mother had said once in the kitchen, not realizing Evie was in the hallway. "And Sophie will make more of it," her father replied. Not might. Will. It was one of those family sentences that lodge like grit. Never dramatic enough to become a speech later. Just quietly permanent. By the time they were teenagers, the roles had settled. Sophie got the better school, the better references, the better odds. She came home with certificates and stories and the names of teachers who adored her. She had friends in little clusters, all glossy ponytails and school trips and parents who wrote handwritten thank you cards. She knew how to enter a room and improve her standing within 30 seconds. Evie became useful. She babysat. She helped clear dishes. She kept out of the way when Sophie's exam stress apparently mattered more than everybody else's existence. She heard things like "you're the sensible one" when what they really meant was "you've learned not to expect much." She was not stupid. That's the part people often missed. Evie was never stupid. She was just not bright in the way adults found easy to reward. She was not naturally polished, not charming under pressure, not a girl who glowed in classrooms. She took longer. She second-guessed herself. She preferred figuring things out alone, which looks a lot like aimlessness if nobody bothers to look closely. By 16 she had thoroughly understood her position in the family. If Sophie won, it was proof of who she was. If Evie managed something, it was mildly surprising, like a dog opening a gate. She stopped trying to compete because competing meant standing where people could compare you properly, and she had had enough of that by then. Instead, she began doing something else. She went quiet in a different way. Not defeated. Just hidden. At school, she did fine. Not brilliantly, not disastrously. She left with the sort of results that cause relatives to say, "Well, there are lots of paths in life," while already moving the conversation back to whoever did better. Sophie went on to university in Bristol, then a master's, then internships people were impressed by because they sounded expensive. Evie stayed home for a while and worked in a garden center cafe where nobody expected much beyond getting the orders right and not dropping Victoria's sponge on pensioners. Her mother described this period as Evie finding herself, which sounded gentler than "we've stopped asking." What nobody noticed, or perhaps what nobody bothered to notice, was that Evie was always watching how things worked. At the cafe she learned which products sold faster when moved 3 feet closer to the till. She learned that people bought more if the chalkboard signs sounded human rather than clever. She learned how often managers ignored simple inefficiencies because nobody with authority had suffered from them directly enough to care. Then she moved to a small homeware shop in town, partly because the hours were steadier and partly because the owner, a tired woman named Maureen, let her near the stock system. That was where something sharpened. Evie turned out to be very good at seeing mess clearly. Not just physical mess. Structural mess. Ordering mistakes. Pricing gaps. Supplier delays. Packaging waste. Websites that looked nice but made buying things harder than they needed to be. She could sit with a notebook and untangle a process quietly while everybody else was still moaning about the symptoms. She still wasn't flashy about it. Never would be. But she had one of those minds that did not need applause to keep working. At 21, after Maureen complained for the 100th time about how impossible it was for small independent homeware shops to source decent modern stock without getting ripped off by trendy wholesalers in London, Evie started thinking seriously. At first it was only a side idea. A cleaner supply platform for smaller home and lifestyle retailers. Less nonsense, fewer middlemen, smaller minimum orders, better packaging, actual customer support, sensible product lines that didn't all look like they'd been named by a woman in Hackney who called cushions soft furnishings. She began in the least glamorous way possible, spreadsheets on an old laptop at the end of her bed, tea going cold beside her, YouTube videos about e-commerce logistics, wholesale margins, shipping software, digital catalogs, startup finance. Nothing cinematic. Just a lot of evenings while the rest of the house watched television downstairs. She taught herself slowly. That became the pattern of her 20s. While Sophie built the kind of life that photographs well, graduate schemes, LinkedIn updates, networking drinks, expensive coats she bought at sample sales and somehow always mentioned Evie built in secret. Not because she was trying to spring some dramatic reveal one day. Mostly because she had learned, over years, how much easier it was to work when nobody was waiting for you to fail. She registered a small company at 22. No launch party. No speech. Just a late-night form, a bank account, and the odd feeling that the world allowed things to become legally real with far less ceremony than expected. The first year was embarrassing and tiny. She sold almost nothing. A supplier in Leeds ignored her for 3 straight months. Her first website looked like it had been assembled by an exhausted pigeon. She underpriced one entire line of ceramic planters and made about 40 pence in actual profit after packaging. A customer in Kent emailed to say, "I support small businesses but your returns page reads like a hostage letter." Evie laughed so hard at that she nearly woke the house. Then she fixed it. That was what she did, over and over. She fixed things. She worked days, built nights, saved every bit she could, and said almost nothing about any of it. If her parents asked what she was doing in her room so much, she said just working on something. They accepted that in the absent way people accept background noise. When Sophie came home for holidays, she filled the house the way she always had. New stories. New people. New versions of herself, always a little shinier than the last. She worked in branding for a while, then strategy, then some graduate management program her parents repeated to neighbors as if they'd personally secured it through moral excellence. Sophie was not a villain, exactly. That would have made things simpler. She could be kind. Funny. Generous when it cost her nothing. But she had grown up inside admiration the way some children grow up inside central heating, so constantly she no longer noticed its existence. She assumed rooms would tilt toward her. She assumed her opinions carried more shape than others. And when she talked to Evie, there was often a softness in her tone that sounded like concern and landed like insult. You always were happier doing your own little projects. Little. Everything about Evie's life was little to Sophie until proven otherwise. By 24, Evie's company had a name, Hearth and Thread Supply. It sounded bigger than it was, which she considered one of the few dignified liberties business allowed. At first it was only her and a part-time warehouse unit on the edge of town shared with a man who sold reclaimed gym equipment and smelled constantly of dust and protein powder. She sourced practical, attractive homeware and small decor lines for independent retailers who were tired of buying overpriced nonsense in bulk from suppliers who treated them like afterthoughts. She was good at understanding what small shops needed because she'd worked in one. She was good at margins because she'd spent years living under them. She was good at customer service because she genuinely hated being fobbed off herself. That went further than confidence did. By 26, she had 3 employees. By 27, she moved into proper premises. By 28, she had a national retailer partnership and a larger warehouse and a real operations manager called Dan who said things like "we need to think in quarters now" while eating crisps at his desk. Still, most of her family had only the vaguest idea what she did. Partly because they never asked properly. Partly because Evie had stopped volunteering information to people who listened only long enough to sort it into impressive or not. If someone at Christmas said, "So, still doing the online shop thing?" she would say yes and reach for the gravy. It amused her, in a private way, that her parents told friends Sophie worked in strategic brand consultancy with visible pride while describing Evie's business as something in home products, I think. By then, Hearth and Thread employed 17 people. Evie could have corrected them. She never did. There was power in being underestimated once you stopped mistaking it for shame. The family dinner where everything shifted happened on a damp Saturday in November at her parents' house in Solihull. The kind of evening built from overcooked roast potatoes, too much wine, and accumulated family roles everyone unconsciously stepped back into. Sophie arrived late, glossy as ever, in a camel coat and boots that made a point when they hit the hallway tiles. She kissed both parents, kissed the air near Evie's cheek, and announced within 8 minutes that she had something quite exciting to share. Evie knew that tone. It meant everyone should put down cutlery and prepare admiration. They were halfway through dinner by then. Her father had already asked Sophie twice about the market just now in the tone of a man trying to show he understood modern capitalism because his favorite daughter was in it. Her mother kept topping up Sophie's wine as if hydration improved achievement. "What is it?" her mother asked, beaming in advance. Sophie gave it the exact pause it wanted. "I've got an interview on Monday morning for head of brand partnerships at this incredible company." Her father whistled softly. "Head of?" "It's a big role," Sophie said modestly, which was her best and most practiced kind of a modesty. "Very growth stage, very ambitious, lots of potential. And the salary is..." She named a figure that made her mother physically sit back in her chair. "Plus bonus." "Bloody hell," said her father. "Language," said her mother automatically, smiling the whole time. Evie buttered a piece of bread and said nothing. Sophie went on. "Honestly, it feels like the exact right move. Smaller than where I am now, but much more exciting. Proper founder-led business. Real scale. Great reputation in the sector." There was something about that description that made Evie look up properly. "What company?" she asked. Sophie turned to her almost as if surprised she'd spoken. "Hearth and Thread Supply," she said. For 1 second, the room altered around Evie. Not dramatically. Nobody dropped a glass. Nobody gasped. But inside her own body, something sharp and clear clicked into place. She set the butter knife down carefully. Her mother, not noticing anything, said, "Do you know it, Evie?" Evie looked at Sophie. Sophie smiled with that smooth, superior warmth she'd had since adolescence. "I doubt it. It's quite niche." That nearly made Evie laugh. She kept her face straight and reached for her water instead. If Sophie had said the role title alone, Evie might have let it pass as coincidence. But the specific salary band, the founder-led description, the Monday interview, no. She knew exactly what it was. They had listed that job 3 weeks earlier after their current partnership's lead resigned to move to Copenhagen with her wife. Dan had moaned about recruitment agencies for an entire afternoon. Evie herself had signed off on the shortlist panel. She had not seen every CV that came through. The final interview list had been handled by HR and department heads first. She was due to sit in on the last stage interviews Monday morning. Across the table, Sophie was still talking. "They've grown fast but not in a messy way, which I like. Strong visual identity. Huge white space in the market. And I think with the right strategic leadership dash." Evie took a sip of water to stop herself smiling too soon. Her father said, "Sounds right up your street." "Oh, completely," Sophie said. "They need someone polished enough to take them to the next stage." There it was. So cleanly Sophie. Not just excitement, but the assumption that her arrival improved whatever she entered. Evie's mother turned to her. "Maybe you should have a look on their website, love. It might give you ideas for your little business." This time Evie did smile. "A small one. Hardly there." "Maybe," she said. Nobody noticed anything strange, though later she would replay that whole dinner and think the funniest part was how close they all sat to the truth without touching it. Sophie left not long after dessert because she had prep to do. Her parents walked her to the door like she was leaving for war rather than another interview in London. Evie stayed behind to help stack plates, mostly because routine felt safer than reacting. Her mother rinsed glasses and said, "Wouldn't it be amazing if Sophie got this one? It could really set her up." Evie dried a plate. "Maybe. You should be more pleased for her." Evie looked at the tea towel in her hands and almost said it then. Instead she said, "I am." That wasn't even fully a lie. She was pleased, in some distant abstract way, that Sophie had ambition. What she was not prepared to do was soften the irony for everybody else's comfort. Monday morning arrived grey and cold. Evie got to the office early. Their headquarters sat in a converted brick building outside Birmingham now, all practical modern interiors, light wood tables, glass meeting rooms, and the faint permanent smell of coffee and cardboard. Not flashy. Efficient. Real. Everything in it had been earned the slow way. At 7:30, Dan came into her office holding a folder and grinning. "You are going to enjoy this," he said. Evie took the folder. On top was Sophie's CV. There she was in polished bullet points and strategic language. Impressive education, strong work history, clean branding roles, partnerships experience, salary expectations exactly in line with what she'd boasted about. A professionally confident cover letter full of phrases like scalable opportunity and brand storytelling ecosystems. Dan leaned against the door frame. "You've gone weirdly calm." Evie closed the folder. "My sister." He blinked. "What?" "My younger sister. Family golden child. Told everyone at dinner Saturday about this amazing role at this incredible company." Dan stared, then burst out laughing so hard he had to put the folder down on her desk. "You're joking." "I wish I was." "Does she know?" Evie shook her head. "Oh, this is better than telly." She should probably have felt more conflicted than she did. But mostly what she felt was something like stillness. Not revenge exactly. Something more satisfying than that. Reversal. At 10 on the dot, Sophie was shown into the interview room by HR. Evie watched through the glass panel for a second before entering from the side door with Dan and Priya, the external advisor they used for senior hires. Sophie sat at the table in a navy suit, leather portfolio open, posture perfect. Then she looked up. And saw Evie. People say gobsmacked too often. Usually they just mean surprised. This was gobsmacked. Sophie's whole face emptied first, then filled too quickly. Shock, confusion, calculation, embarrassment all trying to arrive at once. For a second she looked younger than Evie had seen her in years. Not polished. not adored. Just completely unprepared. Evie took her seat at the head of the table. Not dramatically. Not coldly either. Just naturally, like someone sitting in her own place. "Morning," she said. Sophie stared. "Evie?" Dan made a heroic attempt not to smile. Priya, who knew the story only in outline and lived for this sort of professional nightmare, glanced between them and said, "Shall we give you a moment?" "No," Evie said calmly. "Let's continue." Sophie looked at the room, then back at Evie as if waiting for someone to explain the joke. "You work here?" That could have been cruel, but Sophie sounded too shaken to manage cruelty properly. Evie folded her hands on the table. "I do." Dan coughed into his fist. Sophie blinked hard. "In what capacity?" That nearly got a laugh out of Evie, but she held it in. "I'm the founder," she said. "And CEO." Silence. Beautiful, solid, impossible silence. Sophie's mouth opened slightly, then shut. She looked around the room again, maybe hoping someone would rescue her with context. Nobody did. The context was sitting right there in front of her wearing a cream blouse she'd once described as surprisingly elegant for you. To her credit, Sophie tried to recover. You did not get as far as she had in life without some instinct for self-repair. "Right," she said, with a little breath that was trying to become a laugh and failing. "Well. Wow. I had no idea." "I gathered that," Evie said. Priya, ruthlessly professional, picked up the interview sheet. "If everyone's comfortable, we'll proceed." Sophie looked like she wanted to say she was not comfortable in the slightest. But pride is a strange thing. It will sometimes make people stay in rooms they would be wiser to leave. So the interview began. It was not a disaster, exact.